The garage was always a quiet place. My brother used it as a workshop, a space to escape into the solace of tinkering with his tools. It was an oddly comforting smell: oil, grease, and the faint trace of sawdust that hung in the air. I liked it here too, though for different reasons. It was a space where I could clear my head, away from the chatter of family gatherings. But tonight, it felt different. It felt like I shouldn't be here. Not with her. Emily, my brother's wife, stood by the workbench, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of one of the wrenches. She wasn't supposed to be here either, at least not like this, standing in the dim light with that look in her eyes. Something unspoken, something unreadable. I had always admired her, not just for her beauty, though she was striking, but for the way she carried herself with this effortless grace. She was intelligent, quick-witted, always a few steps ahead in conversation. But she was my brother's wife, and that was the line I had never crossed, not even in thought. Or so I had convinced myself. The silence between us stretched, filled only by the distant hum of crickets outside the garage door. I shifted uncomfortably, unsure of why I had even come out here. Maybe I had needed a break from the suffocating closeness of the house. Maybe I was running from something I didn't want to face. But here I was, and here she was, and it felt like we were both waiting for something to happen, something neither of us could define, but both of us could feel. "Are you looking for something?" I asked, my voice too loud in the stillness of the space. Emily looked up at me, her lips curving into a small smile, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Something deeper than the casual ease she usually showed. "No?" she said softly, almost too softly. "Just thinking." Her fingers lingered on the wrench for a moment longer before she stepped away from the bench, crossing her arms loosely over her chest. She wore a simple white t-shirt, and her jeans were worn, as if she'd been busy with something earlier in the day. But now, she looked like she was searching for something, just like me. "About what?" I asked, leaning against the side of the car, trying to make my voice sound casual, though it felt anything but. I could feel the air between us tightening, like an invisible rope pulling us closer with each passing second. She hesitated, biting her lower lip, before finally meeting my gaze again. "I don't know. Everything, I guess." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what she meant. We had never been particularly close. Sure, there were family dinners and the occasional conversation about movies or books, but there had always been that distance. She was my brother's wife. She belonged to him in a way, and I had always stayed clear of that boundary. But tonight, there was something different in the way she looked at me, like she was seeing me for the first time. Or maybe I was seeing her for the first time. The tension in the air grew, thick and palpable, and I found myself wanting to break it, to say something that would make this moment less charged. But no words came. Instead, she walked closer, just a step or two, but enough for me to notice the subtle shift in her posture, the way her body seemed to lean toward mine as if drawn by some invisible force. I could smell her perfume now, a faint trace of something floral and warm that made my pulse quicken in a way it shouldn't have. "Is something bothering you?" I asked, my voice sounding rougher than I intended. I wanted to step back, to give myself some space to breathe, but I didn't move. Emily tilted her head slightly, studying me with those sharp, perceptive eyes. "Why do you ask?" I shrugged, trying to keep things light, even though I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. "You just seem different tonight." For a moment, she didn't respond. She just looked at me, and in that look, there was something I hadn't seen before. Something that made my heart race, my throat tighten. And then she spoke, her voice low and quiet but steady. "Do I?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. My pulse quickened as the weight of her words settled between us. There was a challenge in her voice, subtle but unmistakable. My throat felt dry, and I was suddenly very aware of how close we were. Too close. "Yeah," I managed, my voice quieter than before. You do. The garage was dimly lit, the overhead bulb casting long shadows that danced across the walls. I could hear the faint sound of the house in the distance, the occasional laughter from inside, the clink of dishes, the murmur of voices. It felt like another world, far removed from the quiet, heavy tension of this moment. Emily stepped closer, the space between us shrinking with each small movement. She was standing so close now that I could feel the warmth radiating from her body, the soft scent of her perfume filling the air between us. Her eyes searched mine, as if looking for something, an answer, a sign, anything that might break the silence. "What are we doing out here?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I swallowed hard, my mind racing for something, anything to say that would ease the tension, but nothing came. Instead, I was hyper-aware of the way my heart pounded in my chest, the way my skin prickled under her gaze. This was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but in that moment it felt like we were both caught in something neither of us could control. "I don't know," I admitted, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The air was thick, and every second seemed to stretch out into infinity. Emily's gaze lingered on mine, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my throat, the weight of the unspoken between us growing heavier with each passing second. And then, without warning, she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against my arm. It was a simple touch, barely more than a graze, but it sent a jolt of electricity through my body. I tensed, my breath catching in my throat as I looked down at her hand. She didn't pull away. Her touch lingered, soft and hesitant, as if testing the waters. My skin burned where her fingers rested, and despite everything screaming at me to step back, to stop this before it went any further, I didn't move. I couldn't. Something held me there, rooted to the spot, and in that moment, I knew we had crossed a line. Maybe we had been crossing it all night. Emily's fingers slid down my arm, her touch deliberate now, and I couldn't help the way my body responded. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to reach out to her, to close the distance between us that suddenly felt too wide. She was so close, and yet it felt like miles of uncharted territory lay between us. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, but she didn't step back. I knew she was right. Every fibre of my being screamed that we were walking a dangerous path, one that would lead to nothing but heartache and regret. But in that moment, none of that seemed to matter. The only thing I could focus on was the way her hand lingered on my arm, the way her eyes searched mine for something, permission maybe, or a reason to stop. But I didn't give her one. Instead, I took a deep breath, the air catching in my throat as I closed my eyes for a brief moment, trying to steady myself. When I opened them again, she was watching me, her expression soft, almost vulnerable, and then she stepped closer. The space between us vanished entirely, and suddenly, I could feel her body pressing lightly against mine, her warmth seeping into me, wrapping around me like a blanket. Her hand slid up to my shoulder, her fingers curling around the fabric of my shirt, and I felt my resolve crumbling. "Emily," I whispered, but the word barely escaped my lips before she leaned in, her breath warm against my skin. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud that I was sure she could hear it too. For a split second, I thought I might pull away. I thought I might step back and put an end to this before it spiraled into something neither of us could take back. But then, before I could make sense of it, her lips brushed against mine. Soft, tentative, but enough to ignite something deep inside me that I had been trying to bury for so long. The kiss was slow at first, almost hesitant, as if we were both testing the boundaries of what was happening. But the tension that had been building between us all night surged, and in an instant the kiss deepened, the hesitation melting away as our bodies moved in sync, responding to something primal and unspoken. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her closer, feeling the heat of her body pressed against mine. Her hands slid up to cup my face, her touch soft but insistent, as if she had wanted this as much as I had but had been too afraid to admit it. The garage seemed to fade away, and all I could focus on was the way her lips moved against mine, the way her breath mingled with mine in the still air. Time seemed to stop. The world outside ceased to exist. And then, just as suddenly, she pulled back, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of shock and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "We can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, though the words felt hollow in the space between us. I knew we couldn't, but the moment we shared, the kiss that lingered on my lips had already changed everything. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us daring to move. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. Emily's breath was still uneven, and I could feel my own heart racing, my mind struggling to catch up with the reality of the situation. It was wrong. We both knew it. But that knowledge didn't change what had just happened, and it didn't stop the ache of wanting more. Emily looked away, breaking the gaze that had held us both captive. She took a shaky step back, her hands falling to her sides as she put some distance between us. I felt the sudden loss of her warmth, the absence of her touch like a cold wind cutting through the garage. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She ran a hand through her hair, clearly rattled by what had just happened. "I don't know what I was thinking." Her words stung, though I couldn't blame her. I wasn't sure what I had been thinking either, or if I had even been thinking at all. It felt like we had both been swept up in something that neither of us could control. Something that had been simmering under the surface for longer than either of us wanted to admit. "Don't apologize," I said quietly, though the words felt inadequate. What could I say to make this right? Nothing would change the fact that we had crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed. She shook her head, as if trying to shake off the weight of the moment, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. "This can't happen again," she said, her voice firmer this time. "It was a mistake. A mistake." The word lingered in the air, twisting something inside me. Maybe it was a mistake, but it didn't feel like one in the moment, and that was what scared me the most. "Yeah," I said, though the agreement felt like a lie. "It won't happen again." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, suffocating, as we both struggled with the implications of what had just transpired. I could feel the weight of her gaze on me, but I couldn't bring myself to meet her eyes. Not now. Not when everything felt so raw. "I should go," Emily said suddenly, breaking the silence. She turned toward the door, her movements stiff, as if she were holding herself together by sheer willpower. I'll see you tomorrow." I nodded, though my mind was miles away. I watched her leave, her figure disappearing through the doorway and into the darkness beyond. The sound of the door closing behind her echoed in the empty garage, leaving me standing there, alone and confused. I let out a long, shaky breath, my body still buzzing with the remnants of what had just happened. The kiss replayed in my mind, over and over, the feel of her lips against mine, the warmth of her body pressed so close. I couldn't shake it, couldn't push it away, no matter how hard I tried. But I had to find a way to forget. The next day came too quickly, and with it, the weight of reality settled in. I couldn't escape the memory of the night before. I tried to bury it, tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than a moment of weakness, but every time I saw Emily, every time our eyes met across the room, the memory came rushing back, vivid and undeniable. We didn't speak about it. We both acted as if nothing had happened, as if we could pretend that the kiss hadn't changed everything between us. But the tension was there, simmering just beneath the surface, threatening to spill over at any moment. It was in the way her gaze lingered on me just a little too long, the way our hands brushed when we passed each other, the way the air seemed to thicken whenever we were in the same room. It was subtle, but it was there, and we both felt it. Days passed, and with each one, the tension between us grew. I could feel it in every glance, every unspoken word, and I knew she felt it too. We were both trapped in this web of desire and guilt, unable to escape, but unwilling to confront it. One evening, about a week later, I found myself in the garage again. It had become my refuge, the one place where I could clear my head, where I could escape the suffocating weight of what I was feeling. But tonight, even the garage felt too small, too filled with memories I couldn't escape. I was standing by the workbench, absent-mindedly fiddling with a wrench, when I heard the door creak open behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. I could feel her presence before she even spoke. "Can we talk?" Emily's voice was soft, tentative. I turned slowly, my chest tight with anticipation. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression conflicted. She looked as torn as I felt, and for a moment we just stood there, the silence stretching between us. "What is there to talk about?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Emily stepped further into the garage, closing the door behind her. She didn't come closer, but the space between us felt charged, like it always did now. "I can't stop thinking about it," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. My heart raced. I knew exactly what she meant because I couldn't stop thinking about it either. The kiss had consumed my thoughts, invaded my dreams, and no matter how hard I tried to push it away, it always came back. "Neither can I," said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes searching mine. "This is wrong," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I nodded. "I know." But even as I said the words, I knew they didn't hold any real meaning. We both knew it was wrong. We both knew we shouldn't be here, in this moment, having this conversation. But that knowledge didn't stop the pull between us, didn't change the fact that we were both standing on the edge of something we couldn't ignore. "I don't know what to do," Emily whispered, her voice filled with confusion and guilt. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the tension between us had reached its breaking point, and there was no going back from here. Whatever happened next, we couldn't undo it. Without thinking, I took a step closer, closing the distance between us. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out, gently brushing my fingers against her arm. She didn't pull away. "Maybe we don't need to know," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of everything unsaid. For a moment, she just stared at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing. And then, before either of us could second-guess it, she moved toward me, her body pressed against mine in a way that felt both inevitable and dangerous. The moment Emily pressed against me, the world outside disappeared again. It was just us, standing too close, caught in a tension that was no longer subtle, but electric, impossible to deny. Her breath was warm against my skin, and I could feel the quick rhythm of her pulse matching my own. She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine as if silently asking for permission. Permission to cross the final line that neither of us should have approached, but both desperately wanted to breach. "Emily," I whispered, my voice thick with everything I couldn't say, everything I should have said to stop this before it spiraled any further. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her hand coming to rest lightly on my chest, right over my heart. Her touch was soft but firm, and it sent a jolt through my entire body. She was close enough now that I could feel the heat of her body against mine, her proximity igniting something deep and primal within me. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening," she murmured, her voice shaky but full of need. "I don't want to pretend anymore." Her words undid me. Whatever thread of restraint I had been clinging to snapped in that moment, and before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us completely. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer, and this time when our lips met, it wasn't tentative or hesitant. It was urgent, filled with all the longing and frustration that had been building between us for weeks, maybe even longer. The kiss deepened quickly, our movements unrestrained now as we gave in to the pull that had been simmering under the surface for so long.
Emily's hands slid up to my shoulders, her fingers tangling in my shirt as she pressed herself against me, and I couldn't help the low groan that escaped my throat at the feel of her so close. I backed her up against the wall of the garage, our bodies moving in sync as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. There was no turning back now, no second-guessing what we both wanted. My hands roamed over her body, exploring the curves and lines that had been forbidden to me until now, and every touch felt like a revelation, a release of all the tension that had been building between us for so long. Emily's breath hitched as my hands slid under her shirt, her skin warm and soft beneath my fingers. She arched into my touch, her lips parting with a quiet moan that sent a shiver down my spine. My mind was a whirlwind of desire and guilt, but in that moment, the desire won out, consuming me entirely. We kissed again, deeper this time, more intense, as if we were both trying to make up for lost time. My hands found the hem of her shirt, and with one swift movement I pulled it over her head, tossing it aside. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of my shirt, and soon we were both stripped of the layers that had been keeping us apart, leaving nothing but the heat of our skin and the weight of what we were doing. It was frantic, desperate, and nothing like I had ever experienced before. Every touch, every kiss was charged with an intensity that I hadn't expected, and yet it felt inevitable, as if we had both been leading up to this moment all along. Time seemed to blur as we lost ourselves in each other, the sounds of the outside world fading away until it was just us, caught in this dangerous, exhilarating whirlwind of forbidden desire.
The weight of what we were doing, of who we were to each other, hovered just on the edge of my consciousness, but I pushed it aside, too caught up in the moment to care about the consequences. For what felt like hours, we moved together in perfect sync, our bodies intertwined, the heat between us building to a crescendo that left me breathless and wanting more. Emily's nails dug into my back, her breath coming in ragged gasps as we reached the peak of that tension, and then suddenly, everything shattered. I pulled her closer, my hands gripping her waist as I buried my face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin as the final wave of pleasure washed over me. Her body trembled against mine, and for a brief moment it felt like we had become one, two people who had crossed a line they could never uncross. And then it was over. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the soft, uneven rhythm of our breathing as we stood there, still pressed together, the reality of what we had just done settling over us like a heavy weight. Emily pulled back slightly, her hands sliding from my shoulders to rest on my chest. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or regret. But there was something else too, something deeper that I didn't want to acknowledge. We can't ever let this happen again, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was more of a plea than a statement, as if she were trying to convince herself more than me. I nodded, though the words felt hollow. We both knew it wasn't that simple. What we had just done couldn't be undone, and the connection between us, the pull that had brought us to this point, wasn't going to disappear just because we wanted it to. But in that moment, I didn't have the energy to argue. I was too spent, too overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. Emily stepped back, her hands falling to her sides as she gathered her clothes, her movements hurried and awkward. I watched her in silence, still trying to wrap my mind around the reality of what we had just done. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice shaky as she pulled her shirt over her head. "I don't know what came over me." I wanted to tell her that it wasn't just her, that I had wanted this too, that I had been just as caught up in the moment as she was. But the words caught in my throat. What could I say to make this right? There was no making this right. She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, she stopped, her hand resting on the handle. For a moment she stood there, her back to me, as if she were waiting for something, an apology maybe, or an explanation. But I had neither to give. Without another word, she opened the door and slipped out into the night, leaving me alone in the dim light of the garage, the weight of what we had done pressing down on me like a heavy stone. I stood there for a long time after she left, staring at the door, my mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts, none of them making sense. The air around me felt cold now, the heat from our moment together fading as reality set in. I wanted to believe that we could move past this, that we could pretend it never happened and go back to the way things were. But deep down, I knew better. The days that followed were unbearable. Every time I saw Emily, I was reminded of that night in the garage, of the kiss we had shared and the line we had crossed. We both avoided each other, barely speaking, and when we did, it was awkward, filled with tension and unspoken words. But no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't erase what had happened. The weight of it hung over us like a storm cloud, always there, always threatening to spill over. And no matter how many times we told ourselves it wouldn't happen again, the pull between us remained, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for another moment of weakness to pull us back together. And I wasn't sure how long we could keep resisting. The days felt like weeks, each one dragging on with the weight of unspoken tension. Every time we were in the same room, it felt like the air itself was heavy, charged with the electricity of what had happened in the garage. We avoided each other as much as possible, both of us wrapped in our own guilt and confusion. But avoiding her wasn't enough. It was impossible to escape the memory of that night, impossible to push aside the feelings that still lingered just beneath the surface. Every glance, every accidental touch reignited the tension, no matter how much we tried to pretend it wasn't there. It was a Friday evening when it all came crashing down again. My brother had left for the weekend, some business trip or another, leaving the house quiet. Too quiet. I had tried to busy myself with work, with anything that would keep my mind off of Emily and what had happened between us. But the more I tried to distract myself, the more my thoughts drifted back to her, to the way her lips had felt against mine, the warmth of her body pressed so close to mine. I was in the living room when I heard her coming down the stairs. I didn't look up at first, didn't want to acknowledge her presence, but the sound of her footsteps stopped, and when I finally glanced over, she was standing there, just at the edge of the room, her eyes locked on mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The tension that had been building for days hung between us, thick and suffocating. She looked as conflicted as I felt, her expression a mixture of guilt and something else. Something I didn't want to name but couldn't ignore. "We need to talk," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I wanted to have this conversation. I wasn't sure if talking would solve anything, or if it would just make everything worse. But I couldn't avoid it forever. Emily walked into the room slowly, sitting down on the couch opposite me. She folded her hands in her lap, her eyes avoiding mine for a moment before she spoke. "I can't keep doing this," she said quietly. "I can't keep pretending like nothing happened." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "I know," I said, though I wasn't sure what else to say. What had happened between us couldn't be undone, and we both knew that. But I also didn't know how to move forward from it. "I don't know how to fix this, Emily." She let out a shaky breath, her fingers twisting together nervously. "I don't either, but we have to figure it out. We can't keep pretending. It's killing me." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw the pain in her eyes. She was hurting, just like I was, and for a moment, the guilt of what we had done hit me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about me. It was about her, about my brother, about everything we had destroyed in one moment of weakness. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words barely audible. Emily met my gaze, her eyes softening. "I am too." The silence that followed was unbearable, thick with everything we couldn't say. I wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but I knew that would only make things worse. We had crossed a line, and nothing we did now would change that. "I keep thinking about that night," she admitted after a moment, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I keep thinking about how everything changed." I nodded, my throat tight. "Me too." "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. I don't know how to fix this. There was a long pause, the tension between us growing with each passing second. And then, before I could stop myself, I stood up, crossing the room to sit beside her on the couch. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know if this was a mistake, but something inside me couldn't stand the distance between us anymore. "Emily," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't change what happened, but we have to figure out what comes next." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. I hesitated for a moment, then reached out, gently taking her hand in mine. "I know." Her hand tightened around mine, and for a moment it felt like we were both clinging to each other, trying to find some kind of anchor in the storm we had created. The warmth of her touch sent a familiar jolt through me, but this time I fought to keep my emotions in check. This was dangerous. We both knew that. But there was something between us now, something that wouldn't just disappear because we wanted it to. "I don't know how to move forward," she whispered, her eyes searching mine. I didn't have an answer. The truth was, I didn't know either. I didn't know how we could possibly come back from this, how we could fix the damage we had done. But what I did know in that moment was that I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't ignore the connection between us, no matter how wrong it was. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in, pressing my forehead against hers. It was a small gesture, but it felt intimate, like we were both holding on to something we couldn't let go of. "Whatever happens," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion, "we'll figure it out." Her breath hitched, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped again, like we were suspended in this moment, caught between guilt and desire. And then, slowly, she leaned in, her lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft, hesitant, but filled with everything we had been holding back. I kissed her back, my hand sliding up to cup her face, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything was right again. The guilt, the confusion, the fear. It all melted away as our lips moved together, as our bodies pressed closer, and I knew in that moment that there was no going back. The kiss deepened, and soon we were tangled in each other again, the same desperate, frantic need taking over as it had that night in the garage. But this time there was something different. This time it wasn't just about the physical connection. It was about something deeper, something we both felt but couldn't fully understand. I pulled her closer, my hands moving over her body with a familiarity that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her fingers tangling in my hair as she kissed me harder, and for a brief moment, I let myself forget about everything else. I let myself get lost in her, in the heat of her skin, the taste of her lips, the way her body moved against mine. But then, just as quickly as it had started, she pulled back, her breath shaky as she stared at me with wide eyes. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't." I nodded, though my heart was racing, my body still humming with the need for her. "I know." She stood up quickly, distancing herself from me, her hands shaking as she ran them through her hair. "This is too much," she said, her voice cracking. "I can't handle this." I stood too, trying to keep my voice steady. "Emily, I need time," she interrupted, her eyes pleading with me. "I need time to figure this out." I nodded, though the thought of being apart from her, even for a little while, felt unbearable. But I knew she was right. We both needed time. Time to process what had happened, time to figure out what this meant for us, for everyone. She left the room without another word, leaving me standing there, my heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. I knew that this wasn't the end. I knew that no matter how much time passed, we couldn't go back to the way things were. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But as I stood there, staring at the empty space where she had just been, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would we figure it out? Would we find a way to move forward, to make sense of the mess we had created? Or had we destroyed everything beyond repair? The future felt uncertain, like a storm brewing on the horizon, and I wasn't sure if we would survive it. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed felt like an endless loop of confusion and longing. Emily had distanced herself from me, and I respected that. I gave her space. But that didn't stop my thoughts from drifting back to her every time I closed my eyes. Every room in the house reminded me of her. Every quiet moment was filled with the memory of her touch, the weight of her gaze. I tried to busy myself, hoping that staying occupied would numb the pull between us, but it never worked. I'd catch glimpses of her when she passed through the kitchen, or when we were forced to interact briefly. Every time, it felt like the tension that had once simmered between us was now threatening to boil over. She avoided my eyes, kept conversations short, but even through that avoidance, I could feel it, the same yearning that hadn't disappeared. We didn't speak of what had happened, not after that last night. But the silence between us spoke louder than any words could. It was like a heavy fog that neither of us could push through, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could stand it. Then, one afternoon, everything shifted again. It was raining outside, a steady, heavy downpour that made everything feel more isolated, more intense. I had been sitting in the living room, staring out the window as the rain lashed against the glass, when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Emily. I could sense her presence, like a magnetic pull that had always been there, stronger now that we had been avoiding each other. I heard her pause in the doorway, but she didn't say anything. For a moment I thought she might leave, that she might walk away like she had so many times before. But then I felt her move closer. I turned slowly, finding her standing at the edge of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, as if she were trying to protect herself from something unseen. She looked conflicted, torn, and I knew that this was it. This was the moment where everything would either break apart or change forever. "I can't stop thinking about you," she whispered, her voice so soft I almost didn't hear it over the rain. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I stood, my heart pounding as I took a step toward her, but I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if there was anything to say that would make this any easier. The truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about her either, not since the garage, not since the night everything between us had changed. "I can't either," I admitted, the words coming out rough, raw. She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with the same mix of guilt, confusion, and desire that I had been carrying for weeks. The rain outside grew louder, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the beat of my heart. The tension in the room was thick, and I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. Again. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know how to stop this." I stepped closer, my pulse racing. I was close enough now that I could feel the warmth of her body, could see the way her breath came in short, shallow bursts. My mind screamed at me to step back, to leave, to stop this before it spiraled out of control. But my body didn't listen. It never listened when it came to her. "We can't keep doing this," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "We'll ruin everything." Emily nodded, her lips parting as if she were going to speak, but no words came. Instead, she reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against mine. It was a simple touch, but it was enough to ignite that familiar spark between us. "I don't know how to stop," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Neither did I. And before I could stop myself, before I could think about the consequences or the damage we were about to cause, I closed the distance between us. My hands found her waist, pulling her to me, and her lips crashed against mine in a kiss that was anything but soft or hesitant. It was desperate, filled with the need we had both been fighting for too long. This time there was no hesitation, no pulling back. There was only the urgency of our movements, the way our bodies pressed together as if we had been waiting for this moment for weeks. Maybe we had been. We moved through the living room, our hands pulling at each other's clothes, neither of us speaking. There was no need for words anymore. Everything had been said in the way our lips met, in the way her fingers tangled in my hair, in the way my hands gripped her waist, pulling her closer and closer until there was nothing left between us. We stumbled into the hallway, her back hitting the wall with a soft thud as I pressed against her, my mouth moving to her neck, my breath coming in ragged bursts. She let out a soft moan, her fingers digging into my shoulders, and that sound, it undid me. I wanted to stop. I wanted to pull back and think, to ask myself what we were doing, but I couldn't. Not now. Not after everything that had already happened. My hands moved down to her hips, lifting her slightly, and she wrapped her legs around me, pulling me in even closer. We kissed again, harder this time, more desperate, and I could feel the heat of her skin through the thin fabric of her clothes. Every touch sent a wave of electricity through me, every movement drawing us further into something we both knew we couldn't control. I carried her to the bedroom, kicking the door shut behind us as we fell onto the bed, our bodies tangling together in a mess of limbs and sheets. She was everywhere. Her lips, her hands, her breath, and I couldn't get enough of her. It was like everything we had been holding back had finally broken free, and there was no stopping it now. The rain outside grew louder, the sound filling the room, but it only added to the intensity of the moment. It felt like the world was falling apart around us, like everything outside this room didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was her. All that mattered was us. Time seemed to blur as we moved together, the tension that had been building between us for weeks, finally reaching its peak. Every kiss, every touch was charged with an intensity I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. And when we finally came together, it was with a force that left me breathless, my mind spinning with everything and nothing all at once. For a long time we lay there, tangled in each other, our breathing slowly returning to normal. The weight of what we had just done hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. I knew that this wasn't just a one-time thing. It wasn't just a mistake we could brush off or pretend never happened. This was something bigger, something that had been simmering between us for longer than either of us wanted to admit. Emily shifted beside me, her fingers lightly tracing patterns on my chest as she stared up at the ceiling. She didn't speak, but I could feel the same turmoil inside her that I felt. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "What now?" she whispered finally, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know how we could move forward from this, or if we even could. All I knew was that things had changed, again, and there was no going back. "I don't know," I said honestly, my voice rough with exhaustion. Emily let out a long, shaky breath, her fingers stilling against my chest. "Neither do I." For a long time, we lay there in silence, the sound of the rain filling the room. Neither of us knew what to say, or what to do. We were both lost in the aftermath of what had just happened, both grappling with the reality of our situation. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. I nodded, though she couldn't see it. Me too. The future felt like an impossibility, like something we couldn't even begin to navigate. The pull between us was undeniable, but the consequences of what we had done weighed heavily on us both. Could we keep pretending? Could we keep this secret hidden? Or would it all come crashing down around us, ruining everything in its wake? I didn't know. And as the rain continued to fall outside, I realized that there were no answers. Not now, not yet. All I knew was that whatever happened next, we would have to face it together. The tension between us wasn't something that would simply disappear. It was real, it was raw, and it was dangerous. But as Emily rested her head on my chest, her breath soft and steady, I knew that we couldn't ignore it any longer. The rain eventually stopped, leaving the world outside feeling clean, refreshed, as though it had washed away all the tension in the air. But inside, things were far from clear. Emily remained beside me, her body warm against mine, her breath steady as she lay in my arms. We didn't speak for what felt like hours. I didn't know what to say, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. There was a peace in the quiet, an illusion perhaps, but one that I wasn't ready to break. Eventually she stirred. Her fingers moved softly against my skin before she pulled herself up. her movements slow and hesitant, like she wasn't quite ready to face the world beyond this room. She sat at the edge of the bed, her back to me, the tension in her shoulders palpable. I watched her, my heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. "What now?" she asked again, her voice thick with exhaustion and uncertainty. I pushed myself up, leaning against the headboard. The room was dim, the soft light from the window casting shadows across the floor. I didn't have an answer for her. The same question had been running through my mind since the moment we crossed the line in the garage, and I was no closer to finding an answer now. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Emily let out a shaky breath, her hands coming up to run through her hair. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to stop. But we can't keep doing this." She was right, of course. We couldn't continue like this, sneaking around, pretending like nothing had happened when everything between us had already changed so much. But the idea of walking away, of putting an end to whatever this was, felt impossible. It was as if something fundamental had shifted between us, and I didn't know how to go back to pretending. "I don't want to hurt anyone," she continued, her voice small. "I don't want to hurt him." The mention of my brother hit me like a punch to the gut. I had spent so long trying to bury the guilt, to ignore the reality of what we were doing, but there it was, staring me right in the face. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve the lies, the betrayal, but I didn't know how to untangle myself from this mess, how to let go of the pull I felt toward her. "Neither do I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But I don't know how to stop." She turned then, her eyes meeting mine, filled with the same conflict I had been wrestling with for weeks. We were both trapped in this web of desire, guilt, and confusion, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't seem to find a way out. "I think," she started, her voice breaking. "I think I need to leave." The words hit me like a blow, but I didn't argue. Maybe she was right. Maybe distance was the only way to put an end to this. But the thought of her leaving, of her being out of my life, felt unbearable. It was like ripping a part of myself away, and I wasn't sure I could survive it. "I think it's the only way we can fix this," she continued, her voice barely audible. "If I stay, we'll just keep doing this, and I can't do that anymore." I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest as the reality of her words sunk in. She was leaving, and this, whatever we had, was ending. But it had to. I nodded, though the movement felt robotic, disconnected from the emotions swirling inside me. "If that's what you need," I said, though the words felt hollow. "I understand." Emily looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She was stronger than that, stronger than both of us. She stood slowly, gathering her clothes, moving quietly around the room as she prepared to leave. I wanted to say something, to stop her, to ask her to stay. But I knew that it would only prolong the inevitable. This had to end. We both knew that. As she reached the door, she paused, her hand resting on the frame. She didn't turn to look at me, but I could hear the emotion in her voice when she spoke. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For everything." And then she was gone. The sound of the door closing behind her echoed in the empty room, and I was left alone with nothing but the silence and the weight of what we had done. I sat there for a long time, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything, to make sense. But nothing did. All I felt was the ache of her absence and the suffocating guilt that wrapped itself around me like a vice. Emily was gone, and with her, the storm that had been brewing between us. But the damage had already been done. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and no matter how much distance she put between us, the memory of what we had shared would linger, unspoken, unresolved, but always there, just beneath the surface. Days passed, and true to her word, Emily left. She packed her things quietly, slipping out of the house without much fanfare. My brother didn't question it. He assumed she needed some space, maybe a break to clear her head, and I let him believe that. I didn't have the heart to tell him the truth. And maybe I never would. The weeks that followed were filled with an emptiness that I couldn't shake. I threw myself into work, into anything that would keep my mind off of her, but it didn't help. Everywhere I went, I saw her. Her smile, the way she laughed, the way her fingers brushed against mine when no one was looking. The memories haunted me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape them. I didn't know where Emily had gone, and I didn't ask. Maybe it was better this way. Maybe distance would give us both the time we needed to figure out what we wanted, what we were willing to sacrifice for the sake of this impossible connection. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, I couldn't help but wonder if I had lost her forever. The days turned into weeks, and life moved on, as it always does. My brother didn't seem to notice the change in me, the way I had become quieter, more withdrawn. Or maybe he did, and he was just too kind to say anything. Either way, the guilt of what I had done weighed on me every day, and I knew that I would carry it with me for the rest of my life. I never saw Emily again after she left. She disappeared from my life as quickly as she had entered it, leaving behind nothing but the ghost of what we had shared. And though I knew it was for the best, though I knew that this was the only way to protect the people we cared about, a part of me would always wonder, what if? What if things had been different? What if we had met under different circumstances, without the weight of guilt and betrayal hanging over us? What if we had given ourselves the chance to be together without fear? But those questions would remain unanswered, lost in the silence that followed her departure. In the end, we had both made our choices, and now we would have to live with them.